June 13th, 1584. Nuremberg's Hauptmarkt Square overflows with citizens who've abandoned their trades to witness justice. Merchants close shops. Mothers lift children onto shoulders. The wealthy lean from rented windows while the poor press against the scaffold's barriers. 10,000 eyes focus on a single man standing motionless beside a massive wooden wheel, his sword reflecting the afternoon Sunday. Frantz Schmidt adjusts his red gloves with the precision of a surgeon preparing for delicate work. The condemned man, Hans Vogle, accused of highway robbery and murder, has already been secured to the wheel's spokes. His limbs are stretched through gaps designed specifically to expose joints for braking. The crowd quiets. Even the vendors stop hawking their wares. Schmidt raises the iron bar. His movements are neither rushed nor hesitant. He has done this 361 times before. He will do it 33 more times after today. Each strike will land exactly where he intends, breaking bones in the sequence that maintains consciousness longest while ensuring inevitable death. This is not cruelty. This is precision. This is justice, as Nuremberg understands it. The first blow shatters Vogle's right shin with a sound like a walnut cracking. The crowd exhales collectively. Some turn away. Most lean forward. Schmidt continues methodically. Left shin, right thigh, working his way up the body with strikes that never miss their mark, never require repetition, never show emotion. Between strikes, Schmidt pauses. Not from fatigue or doubt, but because the law requires specific intervals. The condemned must have time to pray, to confess additional crimes, to serve as a living sermon on the wages of sin. Vogle screams, then prays, then screams again. Schmidt waits with the patience of stone, the iron bar resting against his shoulder like a craftsman's tool between measurements. This is Meister Frantz Schmidt, Nuremberg's executioner for 45 years, the man who would personally end 394 lives and torture hundreds more. He is simultaneously the most hated and most necessary man in the city. Children cross streets to avoid his shadow. Adults refuse to speak his name directly. Yet, when justice demands death, they summon him with desperate urgency. But here's what history has hidden until recently. Schmidt didn't just kill, he documented. For 45 years, he kept a secret diary that recorded every execution, every torture, every flogging in clinical detail. This journal, discovered centuries later, reveals horrors far darker than any chronicle dared record publicly. It shows us not just the deaths, but the man who dealt them. Not just the justice, but the system that demanded it. Not just the executioner, but the human being trapped inside the role. What kind of man can break bodies on the wheel at dawn and tend his garden in the afternoon? How does someone raised from birth to kill develop the precision that made him legendary? Why did a society that needed executioners desperately also declare them legally inhuman? Schmidt's diary answers these questions with entries so matter-of-fact they're more disturbing than any sensationalized account. Cut off the heads of 3 women who had murdered their children. He writes on one date, burned alive a woman who had poisoned her husband on another. No emotion, no judgment, just dates, names, methods, and occasionally, almost as an afterthought, the crimes that warranted such ends. But the diary also reveals something extraordinary. After 45 years of dealing death, after becoming the most prolific executioner in recorded history, Frantz Schmidt achieved something that should have been impossible. He transformed himself from pariah to physician, from taker of life to giver of health, from the most despised man in Nuremberg to one officially declared honorable by the Holy Roman Emperor himself. This is not a story of simple brutality. It's the story of a man born into a profession that made him legally subhuman, who mastered death with such precision that he became indispensable to justice, who documented horrors with the detachment of a clerk, and who ultimately transcended the very role that defined him. We're about to descend into the world of medieval justice where death was theater, torture was law, and one man stood at the center of it all, simultaneously essential and untouchable, necessary and despised, human and yet declared legally otherwise. Prepare yourself. The diary of Frantz Schmidt contains entries that will challenge everything you think you know about justice, mercy, and the price one man paid to serve a society that needed him but could never accept him. But before diving into these forgotten stories of institutional cruelty, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. Heinrich Schmidt never intended to become an executioner. In 1553, he was a woodcutter in Hof, a respectable tradesman with a family and a future. Then 3 men knocked on his door with an offer that wasn't really an offer at all. The town needed an executioner. Heinrich had been chosen. Refusal meant death. The circumstances were typical of how many became executioners in medieval Germany. The previous executioner had died, possibly murdered by relatives of someone he'd executed. The town council needed a replacement immediately. 3 criminals awaited execution, so they selected Heinrich, essentially at random, and informed him of his new profession at sword point. The moment Heinrich accepted, he ceased to be fully human in the eyes of the law. The position of executioner carried a unique legal status, necessary for society's function, but excluded from society itself. He could no longer enter churches through the main door. His money was considered tainted and had to be washed before merchants would accept it. His children could never join guilds, marry respectable citizens, or hold honorable professions. This dishonor was hereditary, passing from father to son like a cursed inheritance. When Franz was born in 1554, his fate was already sealed. He would never be a merchant, craftsman, or farmer. He would be an executioner, or nothing at all. The infant Franz entered a world where his family existed in a strange parallel society. They lived in Nuremberg but weren't citizens. They served justice but couldn't receive it. If someone attacked an executioner's family, no court would hear their case. If someone cheated them in business, they had no legal recourse. They were simultaneously inside and outside the law, enforcing it while being denied its protection. The Schmidt family occupied a house on the edge of town, carefully positioned to be accessible when the city needed them, but isolated enough that respectable citizens could avoid contamination. The house itself became a kind of prison, a place where the family could exist without inflicting their presence on others. Young Franz grew up understanding that other children couldn't play with him. Not wouldn't, but couldn't. Their parents forbade it under threat of beating. He learned to recognize the subtle movements of people avoiding him on streets, the way conversations stopped when he appeared. The hand gestures meant to ward off evil that citizens made when they thought he wasn't looking. The psychological impact of this isolation shaped everything about Franz's early life. He received education. His father could afford tutors since executioners were well paid, but no school would accept him. He learned to read and write, unusual for the time, but had no one to correspond with. He developed skills in mathematics and observation, but could never apply them to any respectable trade. His father Heinrich tried to shield him from the worst of society's rejection, but certain incidents were unavoidable. Franz's diary mentions a childhood memory of attending a festival where he was recognized and forcibly expelled. The crowd didn't just remove him. They performed a ritual cleansing of the space he'd occupied, scrubbing the ground with holy water as if his presence had left a physical contamination. By age 10, Franz understood his future with brutal clarity. He would follow his father's profession because no other path existed. He could flee Nuremberg and try to hide his identity elsewhere, but discovery would mean execution as a vagabond. He could become a criminal, but that would lead him to the scaffold from the other side. Or he could accept his fate and master it. What's remarkable about Franz's early life is not that he accepted his destiny, but that he embraced it with something approaching enthusiasm. Where others might have grown bitter or rebellious, Franz became studious. He began accompanying his father to executions not with reluctance, but with the focused attention of an apprentice learning a craft. Heinrich Schmidt was, by all accounts, a competent but unremarkable executioner. He performed his duties adequately, neither bungling executions nor showing particular skill. But he recognized something different in his son, an intellect that could transform mere competence into mastery, a precision of mind that could elevate execution from crude necessity to something approaching art. The training began when Franz was 12, not with actual executions, but with study, anatomy texts when they could be obtained, observation of livestock slaughter to understand how bodies come apart, practice with weighted swords on pumpkins and cabbages to develop the specific muscle memory required for decapitation. This wasn't casual preparation, but systematic education in the mechanics of death. The social paradox of the executioner's position became more pronounced as Franz grew. Nuremberg was a free imperial city, proud of its independence and legal sophistication. It needed executioners to maintain order, to demonstrate that crime had consequences, to perform the violent theater that reinforced social hierarchy, yet it despised the very people who provided this service. Executioners were barred from taverns unless they sat in designated areas. They couldn't attend guild meetings, participate in civic celebrations, or even receive communion with other citizens. When they died, they were buried in separate sections of graveyards, often outside consecrated ground. Their touch was considered polluting. Their presence was believed to bring bad luck. This wasn't simple superstition, but structured social engineering. By making executioners untouchable, society created a class of people who could perform necessary violence without contaminating the social order. They were human tools, conscious instruments that could be employed when needed and ignored when not. But the system created its own contradictions. Executioners needed to be skilled enough to perform their duties properly. A bungled execution reflected badly on the city's reputation. They needed to be educated enough to understand legal procedures and document their work. They needed to be stable enough to perform their duties reliably for decades. Yet society gave them no incentive for excellence except professional pride, and no reward except money that others considered cursed. Young Franz observed these contradictions with an intelligence that would later transform him from mere executioner to something unprecedented. He saw that mastery of his craft might not earn him acceptance, but could earn him something perhaps more valuable, indispensability. If he became not just an executioner, but the best executioner, not just competent but exceptional, he might achieve a status that transcended the usual categories. At 15, Franz made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would not just accept his role, but perfect it. He would study death with the dedication of a scholar. He would develop precision that made other executioners look like butchers. He would document everything, creating a record that would outlive the prejudice against him. This decision wasn't born from cruelty or bloodlust, but from a peculiar form of ambition. Unable to achieve honor through conventional means, Franz would achieve it through excellence in the only field available to him. He would become so good at dealing death that even those who despised him would have to respect his skill. Instead of fleeing this fate, Schmidt embraced it and began perfecting death with a dedication that would make him legendary, feared, and ultimately something no executioner had ever been before. Honorable. May 1st, 1573. Bamberg's Market Square. Frantz Schmidt, 19 years old, stood beside his father holding a sword that felt heavier than its actual weight. The crowd was smaller than Nuremberg's, perhaps 300 people, but their eyes carried the same mixture of excitement and revulsion that marked all execution crowds. The condemned man, Leonhard Russ of Siern, knelt on the wooden platform, convicted of theft and murder. Heinrich Schmidt stood behind his son, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to make clear who held the sword. This was Franz's examination, his transition from apprentice to journeyman in the trade of death. Years of preparation had led to this moment: the anatomy lessons, the practice strikes, the observation of dozens of executions. Now theory would become practice. The sword was a family heirloom of sorts, 3.5 feet of German steel, with a grip wrapped in red leather. Heinrich had taught Franz its balance, the way it wanted to move through air, the specific angle that would separate vertebrae cleanly. They had practiced on animal carcasses, studying how different angles of strike produced different results, how the blade's weight could work with gravity rather than against it. But animals didn't kneel. They didn't pray. They didn't turn their heads at the last moment or tense their shoulders in anticipation. Franz had studied these human variables by watching his father work, noting how experienced executioners read the condemned's body language, timed their strikes between breaths when muscles were most relaxed, compensated for involuntary movements. The preparation ritual was as important as the strike itself. Franz approached Russ and spoke the traditional words asking forgiveness, a paradox where the executioner begged pardon from the person he was about to kill. Russ, following equally traditional form, granted it. This exchange transformed execution from murder to sacrament, from personal violence to impersonal justice. Franz positioned himself, feet precisely placed as his father had taught him. The sword raised not too high, which would telegraph the strike, nor too low, which would lack necessary force. He had learned to read the crowd's energy, to find that moment when their anticipation peaked, when even breathing seemed to pause. In that silence between heartbeats, he struck. The head separated cleanly, rolling forward as the body collapsed. The crowd exhaled. Some applauded. Others crossed themselves. Heinrich Schmidt nodded once, a gesture more valuable to Franz than any praise from nobles. The stroke had been perfect, death instantaneous, justice served without cruelty or incompetence. But this first execution was just the beginning of an education that would continue for decades. Each execution taught Franz something new, refined his technique, deepened his understanding of the intersection between anatomy and mortality. The sword was the premier tool, reserved for noblemen and citizens of standing. It required the most skill, but offered the most dignity. Franz learned to read the subtle differences in neck structure, how age affected tissue density, how fear or resignation changed muscle tension. He developed a pre-strike ritual that calmed the condemned, a specific way of speaking that encouraged them to position themselves optimally. His father taught him the executioner's economics. They were paid per execution, with rates varying by method and the condemned's status. A simple hanging might earn 2 gulden. A beheading brought 4. Breaking on the wheel could command 10 or more, depending on complexity, but payment came with conditions. A bungled execution meant reduced payment or even fines. Multiple attempts at beheading brought shame to the city and could result in the executioner's dismissal or worse. Beyond the sword, Franz mastered the rope. Hanging seemed simple but contained numerous variables. The knot's position determined whether death came from neck breaking or strangulation. The drop's length affected whether the condemned died quickly or slowly. The rope's thickness and material influenced how cleanly it worked. Franz studied each element with scientific precision. He learned to estimate weight and build, to adjust the rope accordingly. Too long a drop for a heavy person might result in decapitation, traumatizing spectators. Too short for a light person meant slow strangulation, which appeared cruel and reflected poorly on justice. The ideal was a specific ratio of weight to drop that produced instant neck fracture. The wheel represented execution's most complex form. It wasn't simply breaking bones, but doing so in a prescribed sequence that maintained consciousness while ensuring death. Franz learned which bones to break first, how to angle strikes to shatter without causing instant shock, how to read the condemned's endurance to extend or abbreviate the process as law required. His education extended beyond mere technique to understanding the theater of justice. Public execution wasn't just punishment, but communication. Each element sent messages about crime, authority, and social order. The condemned's final words, carefully scripted or censored, became moral lessons. The executioner's precision demonstrated the state's power. The crowd's reaction reinforced communal values. Franz learned to read crowds, to understand when they wanted swift justice versus extended spectacle. He developed an instinct for managing execution's rhythm, knowing when to pause for prayer, when to proceed despite protests, when to show mercy within law's constraints. This wasn't cruelty, but choreography, turning necessary death into meaningful ritual. The physical training was matched by intellectual study. Franz read legal texts to understand the crimes that brought people to his scaffold. He studied theology to comprehend the spiritual dimensions of his work. He learned Latin to read medical texts that explained anatomy. This education, unusual for someone of his social position, set him apart from other executioners who learned only through repetition. His diary from this period shows systematic self-improvement. He recorded not just who he executed, but how, noting what worked and what didn't. Hans Müller, thief, beheaded. Slight turn of head at last moment required adjustment of angle. Remember to place hand on crown to prevent movement. These weren't confessions, but technical notes, the observations of a craftsman perfecting his trade. The psychological aspects of training were perhaps most challenging. Franz had to learn to see the condemned not as individuals, but as tasks to complete. Yet, he also needed enough empathy to manage their final moments compassionately. Too much emotional distance made him seem monstrous. Too little made the work impossible. He developed what modern psychology might recognize as professional compartmentalization. On the scaffold, he was the instrument of justice, performing necessary work without personal involvement. Off the scaffold, he was a son, later a husband and father, tending his garden and maintaining his household. The boundary between these selves had to be absolute for sanity's sake. His father's final lesson came in 1578, when Heinrich retired, passing the position officially to Franz. The ceremony was simple, a transfer of the executioner's sword before the city council. But Heinrich's words, recorded in Franz's diary, carried weight. "You have mastered death's mechanics, now master its meaning. Every stroke you deliver echoes through eternity. Make them count." At 24, Frantz Schmidt became Nuremberg's official executioner, the youngest in the city's history. He brought to the position not just competence, but innovation. Where others followed tradition blindly, Franz questioned and improved. Where others performed adequately, Franz pursued perfection. He was about to transform execution from crude necessity into something approaching science, documenting every death with precision that would create history's most complete record of medieval justice. The sword that made Frantz Schmidt legendary weighed 6 pounds and measured 42 inches from pommel to point. Unlike military swords designed for combat's chaos, this was an instrument of precision, balanced specifically for one purpose, separating heads from bodies with a single stroke. In 45 years of service, Schmidt would use this sword 394 times. He never required a second stroke. This perfect record wasn't luck, but the result of obsessive preparation. Before each execution, Franz examined his sword with the attention a surgeon gives to scalpels. He checked the edge with his thumb, feeling for any imperfection that might catch on bone or sinew. He tested the balance, making minute adjustments to the grip's wrapping. He cleaned the blade with specific oils that prevented rust while maintaining flexibility. The diary entries reveal his technical precision. On August 12, 1581, he executed Kunigunde Reslerin for infanticide. His notes read, "Woman of slight build, thin neck, visible vertebrae, adjusted stance 2 inches forward to compensate for reduced resistance, clean separation at third cervical vertebra." This clinical language might seem callous, but it represents something deeper, the transformation of violence into technique, of necessary evil into professional excellence. Beheading was considered the most honorable death, reserved for citizens and nobility. The condemned died standing or kneeling, facing death directly, maintaining dignity even in extremity. The sword's swift stroke meant instantaneous death, avoiding the prolonged agony of hanging or breaking. This mercy, however, demanded exceptional skill from the executioner. The pressure on Franz was immense. A bungled beheading brought shame to everyone involved. The city whose justice appeared incompetent, the condemned whose death became undignified torture, and the executioner whose reputation could be destroyed by a single failed stroke. Other executioners sometimes required 2, 3, even 4 attempts to complete a beheading. Each failure increased the crowd's hostility and the condemned's agony. Franz developed innovations that ensured his success. He created a specific platform height that positioned the condemned optimally relative to his own stance. He introduced a small wooden block that supported the chin, preventing last-moment movement. He trained assistants to hold the condemned's shoulders with precise pressure, enough to prevent flinching but not enough to seem forceful. His most significant innovation was psychological. Franz learned that the condemned's mental state affected their physical response. Terror caused muscle tension that could deflect the blade. Resignation produced relaxation that enabled clean cuts. So he developed a pre-execution ritual that calmed the condemned, speaking to them in low, steady tones, explaining exactly what would happen, removing fear of the unknown. On January 15th, 1587, Franz executed Hans Vogle, a patrician's son convicted of murdering a fellow student. The young man's family had petitioned for beheading rather than hanging, a request granted due to their status. Vogle was 22, the same age as Franz's own son. The diary notes. Young Vogle maintained composure, spoke final words clearly, positioned himself without assistance. Death instantaneous. What the diary doesn't capture is the scene described by witnesses. Vogle had been terrified, shaking so badly he couldn't climb the scaffold stairs. Franz descended, spoke to him privately for several minutes, then helped him up. Whatever Franz said transformed the young man's terror into resolution. Vogle walked to the block steadily, spoke his final words, condemning his own crimes, and died with the dignity his family had paid to preserve. This ability to manage the condemned's final moments became part of Franz's reputation. He could calm the hysterical, strengthen the weak, even silence the defiant when necessary. This wasn't kindness, exactly, but professional competence that recognized execution's theatrical nature. A condemned person who died badly reflected poorly on everyone. One who died well reinforced justice's legitimacy. The sword executions followed precise protocols. The condemned would be led to the scaffold, usually constructed in the city's main square for maximum visibility. They wore white shirts, symbolizing the innocence they would regain through death. They were allowed final words, though these were often scripted or censored. They would kneel or stand depending on their status. The executioner would ask for forgiveness. The stroke would follow. But within these protocols, Franz introduced refinements. He studied anatomy texts to understand exactly where vertebrae were weakest. He practiced on cadavers provided by the city, learning how different neck positions affected the blade's path. He developed specific stances for different body types, adjusting his technique for tall or short, heavy or thin, young or old condemned. His diary records 361 sword executions. Each entry notes technical details that reveal constant refinement. Adjusted grip, half-inch higher for better leverage. Slight wind from east required compensation in blade angle. Condemns prayer beads caught on collar, removed before stroke. These aren't just observations, but evidence of continuous improvement, of mastery pursued beyond mere competence. The most challenging executions involved multiple condemned. On June 30th, 1591, Franz beheaded 3 women convicted of witchcraft. The diary notes: Elizabeth Mechtlin first, as youngest and most fearful. Anna Peilerin second, maintained calm after witnessing first. Margaretha Doblerin last, eldest and most resigned. All 3 clean strokes, no delays between. What this clinical description omits is the endurance required. 3 beheadings in succession demanded not just physical strength, but emotional control. The executioner had to maintain focus despite accumulating psychological weight. He had to ignore the crowd's reactions, the blood pooling at his feet, the heads gathered in baskets beside the scaffold. He had to remain precise when repetition might encourage carelessness. Franz's reputation for perfection spread beyond Nuremberg. Other cities requested his services for particularly important executions. Nobility condemned in nearby territories would petition to have Franz perform their beheadings, knowing his skill guaranteed dignity in death. He became not just an executioner, but the executioner, the standard against which others were measured. This reputation brought unexpected benefits. While still socially ostracized, Franz gained a form of respect unusual for his profession. City officials consulted him on legal matters involving capital punishment. Foreign dignitaries visiting Nuremberg sometimes requested to meet him, curious about the man whose skill had become legendary. He remained untouchable, but became, paradoxically, notable. But not all deaths were clean. Some crimes demanded spectacle, suffering made visible as warning to others. For these, the sword was set aside in favor of instruments designed not for mercy, but for message. The breaking wheel stood 8 feet across, reinforced with iron bands that could support the weight of a grown man being systematically destroyed. Unlike the swift mercy of the sword, the wheel promised hours of agony, a death stretched across time to match the severity of certain crimes. Frantz Schmidt operated this instrument 137 times, each instance requiring different skills than beheading, not precision but pacing, not mercy but measured cruelty. July 18th, 1584. The diary entry reads, "Broke with the wheel Hans Müller of Augsburg, who had murdered his master for gold. Began with legs, then arms, finally the coup de grace to chest after 2 hours, as ordered by council. Large crowd, very quiet." This clinical description conceals the elaborate rituals surrounding wheel executions. The condemned would be tied to the wheel's spokes, limbs threaded through gaps to expose joints. Franz would use an iron bar to break bones in a specific sequence determined by the crime's severity. Minor criminals might receive the coup de grace immediately, a blow to the heart or neck that ended suffering quickly. Heinous criminals would be broken from bottom up, starting with shins and working upward, extending agony across hours. The wheel served multiple purposes beyond punishment. It was theater, communicating the consequences of serious crime. It was religious ritual, allowing the condemned time to pray and repent between blows. It was social ordering, demonstrating the state's absolute power over bodies that had violated its laws. Franz understood these dimensions and performed accordingly. His innovation with the wheel involved precise calculation of force. Too strong a blow might cause instant death through shock, defeating the punishment's purpose. Too weak required multiple strikes, appearing incompetent. Franz developed an understanding of exactly how much force would break bones without causing immediate systemic failure. He could maintain consciousness in the condemned for precisely as long as the law required. The diary reveals his systematic approach. For a young, strong criminal, additional force required for femur, reduced for ribs to prevent puncturing organs. For an elderly condemned, Gentler strikes sufficient, body fragile, consciousness brief. He treated each execution as a unique problem requiring specific solutions. But the wheel was just one spectacular method. Fire executions, reserved for witchcraft, heresy, and poison, demanded different expertise. Burning alive was the period's ultimate punishment, combining physical agony with spiritual symbolism. Fire purified, transforming corrupt flesh into smoke that rose toward heaven. It also provided maximum deterrence, the condemned's screams carrying across entire cities. September 23rd, 1590. Franz executed Anna Freyen, convicted of murdering her husband with poison. The diary notes, bound to stake at dawn. Wood arranged in 2 circles, inner dry for quick ignition, outer green for sustained burning, strangled with cord before full flames as act of mercy permitted by council. This mention of strangulation reveals an unofficial mercy Frantz sometimes provided. While the law demanded burning alive, executioners could discreetly strangle the condemned as flames rose, sparing them the full agony. This required skill, applying enough pressure to cause unconsciousness without visible struggle that might upset officials. Franz became expert at this hidden kindness, though he never explicitly documented it. The arrangement of wood for burning was itself a science. Dry kindling at the base ensured ignition. Larger logs maintained heat. Green wood produced smoke that could suffocate before flames reached flesh. The pyre's construction could mean the difference between minutes and hours of suffering. Franz studied these variables with the same precision he applied to sword angles. Weather added complexity. Wind could blow flames away from the condemned, prolonging agony. Rain might extinguish fires, requiring reignition while the half-burned victim waited. Franz learned to read weather patterns, to position pyres for optimal burning, to adjust wood arrangements for conditions. His executions by fire were horrifically efficient. The spectacle of burning attracted the largest crowds. On November 5th, 1592, France burned 3 women convicted of witchcraft. The city square filled before dawn. Vendors sold food and protective amulets. Parents lifted children for better views. The atmosphere was part festival, part religious ceremony, part horror show. Franz's role in these spectacles went beyond mere execution. He was master of ceremonies, managing the event's rhythm. He knew when to pause for prayers, when to allow final words, when to proceed despite protests. He could read crowds, sensing when they wanted swift justice versus extended display. This wasn't cruelty, but crowd control, preventing riots while satisfying public bloodlust. The physical demands of spectacular executions were extreme. Breaking multiple people on wheels required hours of sustained effort. Managing burning pyres in summer heat while wearing formal execution attire tested endurance. Franz maintained physical conditioning unusual for his era, understanding that exhaustion could lead to mistakes that would destroy his reputation. His diary occasionally hints at the psychological toll. After breaking a young man who had killed his family in rage, Franz notes, difficult execution. Condemned wept continuously, calling for mother already dead by his hand. Crowd became agitated. Administered grace blow earlier than ordered. This deviation from protocol suggests even France had limits to the suffering he could inflict. Yet he continued performing spectacular executions for decades, never refusing an assignment, never showing weakness that might suggest unfitness for his role. He developed what modern psychology might recognize as extreme compartmentalization, separating Franz, the executioner, from Franz, the man so completely that he could break bodies in the morning and tend his garden in the afternoon. The wheel and fire executions served their purpose. Crime rates in Nuremberg remained lower than comparable cities. The spectacular nature of punishment deterred through fear, what law couldn't prevent through surveillance. Franz's skill ensured these executions achieved maximum impact without descending into chaotic brutality that might generate sympathy for criminals. But women faced unique punishments, designed not just to kill but to humiliate, to reinforce gender hierarchies through specialized cruelty. The Pegnitz River ran through Nuremberg like a moral boundary, and on March 14th, 1576, it became an execution chamber. Anna Peherin stood on the bridge, bound in a sack with 3 living creatures, a dog, a rooster, and a snake. This was the poena culae, reserved for women who committed infanticide, a crime that inverted natural order so completely it demanded symbolic punishment to match. Frantz Schmidt supervised as assistants sealed the sack with precise knots he had specified. Too loose, and the condemned might escape. Too tight, and death would come from suffocation rather than drowning, defeating the punishment's purpose. The animals weren't random choices, but symbols, the dog representing shamelessness, the rooster unnatural behavior, since they sometimes eat their young, and the snake representing evil itself. The diary entry is characteristically clinical. Anna Peherin of Nuremberg, for murdering her newborn daughter, sewn in sack with animals as prescribed, sank immediately, body recovered after 3 days downstream. But witness accounts provide details Franz omitted. Anna's screams as the animals panicked inside the dark sack, clawing and biting in their terror. The crowd's mixture of satisfaction and horror. The long minutes before bubbles stopped rising. This specialized drowning was just one of many gender-specific punishments Franz administered. Women faced execution methods that men never encountered, punishments designed not just to kill, but to inscribe moral lessons on female bodies. These methods reflected beliefs about women's nature, their crimes, and their place in social hierarchy. Infanticide was the most common capital crime among women Franz executed. Of the 42 women he beheaded, 20 were convicted of killing their children. The circumstances were usually similar. Unmarried servants who became pregnant, faced with ruin, killed newborns in desperation, yet the law showed no mercy for desperation. These women faced the wheel, drowning or beheading depending on circumstances. The diary reveals Franz's apparent discomfort with these executions. His entries about infanticide cases include unusual details about the women's circumstances. Barbara Kuplin, 20 years, servant girl, child born of rape by master's son. Margaret Brunin, widow, 6 children already, husband dead of plague. These contextual notes appear nowhere else in his records, suggesting recognition that these women were driven to extremity rather than evil. Adultery brought specialized humiliation before execution. Women would be paraded through streets wearing signs describing their crimes in explicit detail. Their hair would be shorn publicly, transformed from feminine beauty to shameful nakedness. They might be whipped at crossroads, their backs laid open while crowds jeered. Only after this gauntlet of shame would they face the scaffold. Franz performed these preliminary punishments with the same precision he brought to executions. His whipping was methodical, delivering exactly the prescribed number of strokes to specific body parts. He sheared hair evenly, avoiding the ragged cutting that would suggest emotional involvement. He managed crowds during these spectacles, preventing them from throwing objects or rushing the condemned. But his diary suggests awareness of gender disparities in punishment. Men convicted of adultery typically faced fines or brief imprisonment. Women faced death. Men who killed in rage might receive beheading. Women who killed in desperation received the wheel. These inequalities weren't Franz's to question, but his documentation preserved evidence of systematic bias. Witchcraft accusations brought the most elaborate female punishments. Between 1575 and 1600, France executed 38 women for witchcraft. The standard method was burning, but preparations included torture to extract confessions, public humiliation to destroy reputation, and property confiscation to impoverish families. The diary entry for July 28, 1590, describes executing 3 generations of women from one family. Burned Anna Eberlein, aged 60, then her daughter Catherine, aged 38. Finally, granddaughter Margaret, aged 17. All confessed to witchcraft after questioning. Large crowd, much satisfaction at rooting out evil. What this spare description omits is the horror of forcing women to watch their mothers and daughters burn before facing the same fate. The questioning mentioned was torture involving thumbscrews, leg vices, and controlled drowning. The confessions were often fantastical tales of flying to sabbats and consorting with demons, extracted through pain and leading questions. Franz's role in witch executions extended beyond the final burning. He administered torture during interrogations, his anatomical knowledge making him expert at causing pain without death. He knew precisely how long someone could endure the strappado, how much pressure thumbscrews could apply before bones shattered, how many times someone could be revived from drowning. Yet his diary occasionally reveals skepticism about witchcraft accusations. After executing a woman who maintained innocence despite torture, he notes, "Elizabeth Puffin died protesting innocence. No devil's mark found, despite thorough examination. Crowd seemed uncertain." These observations, dangerous to record, suggest Frantz recognized that some women died for imaginary crimes. Gender influenced execution methods in subtle ways. Women were often executed at dawn rather than noon, supposedly to spare them the larger crowds that gathered later. They were allowed to wear veils to the scaffold, preserving modesty even in death. They received last rites from nuns rather than priests when possible. These small mercies within brutal justice reflected complex attitudes about female nature. The pregnant condemned presented particular challenges. Law forbade executing pregnant women, but determining pregnancy wasn't simple. Frantz supervised examinations by midwives, documented their findings, and tracked pregnancies until birth. After delivery, mothers were usually allowed 6 weeks to nurse before execution, though infants then became orphans bearing their mother's shame. Franz executed women by sword, wheel, fire, and drowning, but never by hanging. This method, common for male thieves, was considered too undignified for women, whose bodies swinging in wind might expose them immodestly. Even in death, gender proprieties were maintained through careful selection of execution methods. His diary's final statistics show that women comprised roughly 15% of his executions, but faced proportionally more spectacular punishments. They were more likely to be burned, drowned in sacks, or broken on wheels. Their crimes, often born of desperation or accusation rather than violence, received harsher sentences than comparable male offenses. These gendered punishments served specific social functions, reinforcing women's subordinate position through spectacular demonstrations of consequence for transgression. Every woman watching another woman burn for witchcraft learned the price of nonconformity. Every servant girl seeing an infanticide drowned knew the cost of sexual vulnerability. The executions were lessons written in female blood for female audiences. Public execution in Nuremberg wasn't chaos, but carefully orchestrated state theater, and Frantz Schmidt was its principal performer. Every execution served multiple functions: punishment for the criminal, deterrence for potential criminals, entertainment for the masses, and most importantly, demonstration of the city council's absolute authority over life and death. Nuremberg in the late 16th century was a free imperial city, meaning it answered directly to the Holy Roman Emperor rather than local nobility. This independence required constant vigilance against both internal disorder and external threats. Public execution became a tool of statecraft, showing citizens and rivals alike that Nuremberg maintained iron control over its population. The city council treated executions as investments in social order. They allocated substantial funds for scaffold construction, crowd control, and the executioner's salary. Frantz Schmidt earned 60 gulden annually, plus additional payment per execution, making him wealthier than most craftsmen despite his parish status. This seeming contradiction, paying well someone society despised, reflected execution's importance to governance. Execution days were carefully scheduled civic events. Minor criminals might be hanged on regular market days when crowds already gathered. Major executions warranted special scheduling, announced weeks in advance to ensure maximum attendance. The council understood that execution's deterrent effect required witnesses. A criminal dying unseen served no political purpose. Franz's role extended beyond mere execution to entire production management. He coordinated with carpenters building scaffolds, ensuring structures could support both equipment and crowds pressing against barriers. He worked with city guards planning crowd control, identifying potential trouble spots where riots might start. He consulted with clergy, arranging spiritual preparation, timing prayers and final rites to maintain ceremony's rhythm. The scaffold's location itself carried political meaning. Most executions occurred in the Hauptmarkt, Nuremberg's main square, surrounded by symbols of civic power, the beautiful fountain representing prosperity, the Frauenkirche representing divine approval, the city hall representing temporal authority. Criminals died at the literal center of civic life, their deaths witnessed by architecture, embodying what they had violated. Different crimes warranted different execution locations, each sending specific messages. Traitors died near city gates, warning visitors that betrayal brought death. Thieves died near markets they had robbed. Blasphemers died within sight of churches they had profaned. Franz transported his equipment across the city, adapting his performance to each venue's particular requirements. Weather added complexity to execution statecraft. Rain might reduce crowds, diminishing deterrent effect. Extreme heat could cause spectators to faint, creating disruption. Wind affected hanging ropes and burning pyres. Franz learned to adapt performances to conditions, sometimes recommending postponement when weather might undermine execution's political purposes. The condemned's final words were politically managed. They were encouraged to confess guilt, praise justice, and warn others against crime. Those who refused faced having their tongues torn out or their mouths gagged. Final speeches that criticized authority or proclaimed innocence were forbidden. Franz enforced these restrictions, sometimes physically preventing unauthorized words from being spoken. Yet within these constraints, Franz developed a reputation for allowing condemned dignity within prescribed limits. He would coach them on acceptable final words that expressed personal messages within political requirements. A man could declare love for his family if he also acknowledged his crimes. A woman could pray for her soul if she also praised the court's wisdom. Foreign visitors often attended Nuremberg executions, and their impressions affected the city's international reputation. Franz's precision and professionalism reflected well on Nuremberg's governance. Bungled executions by less skilled executioners in other cities became diplomatic embarrassments. Nuremberg's council knew that every clean sword stroke, every efficiently managed hanging, enhanced their city's standing. The economic dimensions of execution were substantial. Crowds brought commerce, tavern revenues, food vendors, accommodation for rural visitors. Major executions could generate economic activity equivalent to minor festivals. The council balanced these benefits against disorder risks, sometimes limiting access to execution sites to prevent dangerous overcrowding. Confiscated property from executed criminals funded various civic projects. Franz maintained detailed inventories of condemned possessions, ensuring nothing escaped state seizure. These goods would be auctioned, proceeds supporting everything from poor relief to fortification maintenance. Execution literally built city infrastructure. The religious dimension intertwined with political necessity. Execution was understood as divine justice implemented through human instruments. Clergy blessed scaffolds before use, transforming them from mere platforms into sacred spaces where God's will manifested. Franz's role as executioner made him simultaneously God's instrument and society's untouchable, a paradox reflecting execution's theological complexity. Different religious confessions in Nuremberg, Catholic and Protestant, competed to provide condemned final rites. These competitions reflected broader theological disputes, with each side claiming their ministrations better prepared souls for judgment. Franz navigated these disputes neutrally, allowing condemned to choose their spiritual advisors while preventing sectarian disruption of executions. Class distinctions were reinforced through execution methods. Nobles received sword beheading on elevated scaffolds, with better sightlines for elite spectators. Common criminals hanged on lower platforms, surrounded by standing crowds. These height differences literally placed noble death above common death, maintaining social hierarchy even in execution. Franz became expert at reading political currents affecting his work. During periods of social tension, executions required additional security. When particular crimes generated public outrage, he adjusted performances to satisfy bloodlust without losing control. He understood that execution wasn't just about killing criminals but managing public emotion. The paradox of Franz's position, central to justice but excluded from society, embodied larger contradictions in governance. The state needed violence to maintain order, but couldn't acknowledge violence as foundational. By making executioners untouchable, society pretended that necessary violence was exceptional rather than routine. Yet Franz's competence made him increasingly indispensable to Nuremberg's governance. Council members who wouldn't speak to him socially relied on him absolutely professionally. Foreign dignitaries who would never shake his hand requested his services for their own executions. He became living proof that expertise could transcend social categories, even if it couldn't eliminate them. His diary served governmental functions beyond personal record-keeping. It provided legal documentation of sentences carried out, evidence for imperial reviews, and data for criminal justice policy. The council recognized its value, eventually commissioning an official copy for city archives. The parish's private journal became public record. Through 45 years of service, Frantz Schmidt executed every death sentence Nuremberg imposed without question or hesitation. He never refused an assignment, never showed favoritism, never allowed personal feelings to affect professional duties. This reliability made him more than just an executioner. He became an institution, as fundamental to Nuremberg's governance as its walls or laws. The book measures 8 inches by 6 inches, bound in brown leather now cracked with age. Its pages, handwritten in fading ink, contain the most complete record of capital punishment in Renaissance Europe. Between 1573 and 1618, Frantz Schmidt documented every person he executed, tortured, or flogged in Nuremberg. 394 executions, 345 floggings, hundreds of minor punishments, each entry written in the same steady hand, with the same detached precision. The diary begins simply. Anno 1573. On St. Walpurgis Day, the 1st of May at Bamberg, I executed with the sword Leonhard Russ of Sayern, a thief who had stolen from churches. No explanation of why he began writing, no statement of purpose, just date, name, crime, method, location. The template that would continue for 45 years. But patterns emerge across entries that reveal more than their individual parts. Schmidt recorded not just who died, but how society decided who should die. His diary becomes an inadvertent chronicle of justice, prejudice, and power in Renaissance Germany. The crimes that brought people to Schmidt's scaffold map the period's anxieties. Theft appears most frequently, but theft's definition expanded beyond simple taking. Hans Pruner stole 2 loaves of bread, hanged. Margaretha Voglin stole silver candlesticks from a church, burned. The disparity in punishments reflected not crime severity, but what was stolen, from whom, and by whom. Murder cases reveal social hierarchies through execution methods. Nobleman Georg von Parsberg, who killed a fellow noble in a duel, beheaded honorably with sword. Peasant Hans Froschel, who killed a merchant in robbery, broken on the wheel over 2 days. The same crime, taking human life, warranted vastly different punishments based on perpetrator and victim status. Schmidt's clinical tone occasionally cracks, revealing glimpses of the man behind the executioner's mask. After executing a 14-year-old boy for theft, he notes, "Young Hans Sager, no taller than my own son, trembled so could barely stand, carried to scaffold. After breaking a man who maintained innocence despite torture, proclaimed innocence to the end, crowd grew quiet." These deviations from formulaic entries suggest Schmidt's awareness that justice wasn't always just, yet he never explicitly criticizes the system he served. His role was implementation, not judgment. The diary records what was, not what should be. Patterns in the diary reveal execution clusters corresponding to social crises. During plague years, executions for theft increased as desperation drove crime. During religious conflicts, heresy executions spiked. During economic downturns, infanticide cases multiplied as women couldn't support children. The scaffold became society's pressure release, eliminating those who threatened order when order was most fragile. Serial killers appear in Schmidt's record with disturbing frequency. Christoph Freschel, who murdered 6 travelers for their goods, broken on the wheel from bottom up. Nickel Stuller, who killed 3 women after assaulting them, dragged to execution unhide, then broken. These cases generated enormous crowds and required extra security, their spectacular punishments serving as cathartic releases for communal terror. The diary documents execution innovations Schmidt introduced. Traditional hanging used fixed nooses that strangled slowly. Schmidt developed a sliding knot that broke necks instantly when properly positioned. Traditional wheel breaking was random. Schmidt systematized the sequence for maximum effect, with minimum unnecessary suffering. Women appear in the diary with depressing regularity, their crimes often born of desperation rather than malice. Anna Boehm, abandoned pregnant by her employer's son, killed the newborn, drowned. Barbara Fisher, beaten regularly by her husband, poisoned him, burned. These entries, recording only crimes and punishments, inadvertently document systematic female vulnerability. Children weren't exempt from Schmidt's scaffold. The youngest he executed was 13, a girl who had allegedly poisoned her mistress. The diary notes only, "Showed courage unexpected for her years." This sparse description haunts more than elaborate detail would, forcing readers to imagine a child maintaining composure facing death. Religious executions reveal period prejudices. Jews faced execution for crimes that brought Christians only fines. Anabaptists died for beliefs Catholics and Lutherans held without consequence. The diary documents these disparities without comment, its silence speaking volumes about accepted injustices. Schmidt recorded not just executions, but the entire punishment spectrum. Floggings for minor theft, brandings for repeat offenses, ear cropping for fraud, tongue removal for blasphemy. His comprehensive documentation reveals justice as graduated violence, calibrated to crime severity and criminal status. The physical diary itself tells a story. Early entries are cramped, uncertain, as if Schmidt wasn't sure he should be writing. Middle years show confident penmanship, entries flowing easily across pages. Final years return to cramped writing, but from age rather than uncertainty, the hand trembling slightly, letters less precisely formed. Marginalia appears occasionally, notes added years after original entries. Next to a woman executed for infanticide, child later found alive with relatives. Next to a man hanged for theft, true killer confessed before own death. These additions suggest Schmidt tracked his execution's aftermath, perhaps troubled by irreversible mistakes. The diary's most disturbing aspect is its normalcy. Entries appear between notes about purchasing vegetables and repairing his roof. Executions are recorded with the same matter-of-fact tone as weather observations. Death became routine, scheduled between domestic tasks, stripped of extraordinary nature through repetition. Yet, reading sequentially reveals psychological progression. Early entries show engagement with condemned individuals. Wept throughout, sang hymns beautifully, forgave all enemies. Later entries become purely factual: name, crime, method. The emotional distance increases with experience, a protective callousing against accumulative trauma. Schmidt occasionally documented unusual events: a rope breaking during hanging, requiring re-execution, a condemned man reviving after hanging, legally requiring release since God had clearly intervened, a woman giving birth on the scaffold moments before execution, the baby taken to orphanage, the mother then hanged. These anomalies disrupted execution's routine, forcing recognition of its human cost. The diary's final entry, dated April 30th, 1618, records Schmidt's last execution: Georg Karl, a murderer, beheaded with the sword. No indication this was his finale, no summation of 45 years' service, just another name added to hundreds, another death in thousands, another day in a life defined by dealing death. What kind of man writes his life in names of the condemned? What psychology enables someone to record deaths like grocery lists? The diary provides no answers, only evidence of a man who transformed state-sanctioned killing into bureaucratic routine, who documented horror with accountant's precision, who wrote history in blood with steady hand. On May 1st, 1618, exactly 45 years after his first execution, Frantz Schmidt set down his sword for the final time. He was 64 years old, had executed 394 people, and had achieved something unprecedented in his profession: retirement with honor rather than death or disgrace. But what followed retirement was even more extraordinary. The executioner became a healer. The transformation didn't happen suddenly. Throughout his career, Schmidt had developed medical knowledge through grim necessity. Executioners traditionally served as healers in German cities, their anatomical expertise making them valuable, despite their pariah status. Who better understood the body than someone who had taken it apart hundreds of times? Schmidt's medical practice began while still executioner. People seeking cures for conditions regular physicians couldn't treat would visit his house after dark, entering through back doors to avoid being seen. He set bones broken in accidents, having learned, through breaking them deliberately, where fractures occurred and how they healed. He treated wounds, understanding from inflicting them how flesh separated and reunited. His diary's margins contain medical notes between execution entries, recipes for salves that prevented infection, techniques for stopping bleeding learned from managing execution wounds, observations about which herbs reduced inflammation, discovered through treating torture injuries. This parallel education in healing, alongside dealing death, created unique expertise. The anatomical knowledge gained through execution exceeded what most physicians possessed. Medical schools rarely had cadavers for study. Students learned from books and occasional dissections. Schmidt had observed hundreds of bodies in various states of destruction. He knew exactly how organs connected, where blood vessels ran, how bones articulated. His understanding came not from theory, but practice. After retirement, Schmidt formally transitioned to medical practice. The same hands that had wielded swords began wielding scalpels. The same precision that ensured clean beheadings now set broken bones. The same calm that managed execution crowds now reassured patients. The executioner's skills translated surprisingly well to healing. His reputation as healer spread quickly. Where physicians prescribed bloodletting and prayer, Schmidt offered practical treatments based on anatomical understanding. He could diagnose internal injuries by external signs, having seen bodies opened by torture. He could predict infection patterns, having observed them countless times. His success rate exceeded university-trained doctors. Wealthy citizens, who would never have acknowledged him as executioner, sought him as physician. They entered his house through front doors now, openly rather than secretly. They paid him substantial fees for treatments that worked when conventional medicine failed. The same social barriers that had excluded him as executioner began crumbling before his medical competence. Schmidt specialized in treating conditions other physicians avoided. Compound fractures that typically led to amputation he could sometimes save through precise bone setting. Wounds that wouldn't heal he treated with techniques learned from managing execution injuries. Chronic pain from old injuries he addressed through manipulation methods discovered through causing similar damage. His medical notebook, separate from the execution diary, reveals systematic approach to healing. Patient symptoms recorded with same precision as execution details. Treatment outcomes tracked across months. Successful remedies documented for replication. Failed treatments analyzed for improvement. The executioner's methodical nature served medicine well. Children who had fled his approach as executioner now came for treatment. He developed gentleness with young patients, perhaps compensating for years of necessary hardness. Parents noted his patience, his ability to calm frightened children, skills developed managing condemned prisoners' final moments. The man who had executed teenagers now healed them. Schmidt's transformation challenged fundamental social assumptions. Executioners were considered inherently polluted, their touch contaminating. Yet his healing touch succeeded where others failed. The contradiction forced recognition that social categories might be arbitrary, that untouchable status reflected prejudice rather than reality. The medical establishment initially resisted accepting Schmidt. University-trained physicians complained about an executioner practicing medicine. They petitioned authorities to stop him, claiming he endangered public health. Yet his patients defended him, testifying to cures that established doctors couldn't provide. Results trumped credentials. In 1621, 3 years into retirement, Schmidt achieved something previously impossible for an executioner's family. His son married into a respectable merchant family. The bride's family accepted the union despite Schmidt's past, recognizing that his medical reputation had transformed family standing. The executioner's curse, hereditary dishonor, was breaking. But the ultimate validation came in 1624. Emperor Ferdinand II issued an imperial decree declaring Frantz Schmidt ehrlich, honorable. This wasn't just personal recognition, but legal transformation. Schmidt and his descendants were freed from executioner's stigma, granted full citizenship rights, welcomed into society that had excluded them for generations. The imperial decree cited Schmidt's long and faithful service to justice and his considerable contributions to public health through medical practice. It acknowledged that someone could transcend inherited dishonor through personal excellence. The document, preserved in Nuremberg's archives, represents unprecedented social mobility in rigidly hierarchical society. Schmidt received the decree in Nuremberg City Hall, the same building where he had received death warrants for 45 years. City councilors who had employed him as executioner now congratulated him as citizen. The transformation was complete, from untouchable to honorable, from dealer of death to preserver of life. His final years were spent quietly practicing medicine, tending his garden, and occasionally consulting on difficult legal cases. Former executioners from other cities wrote seeking advice on managing their profession's burdens. He responded with practical suggestions, and perhaps more importantly, proof that executioners weren't forever bound to their roles. Schmidt died on September 20th, 1634, at age 80. His funeral attracted hundreds of mourners, including many he had healed, and surprisingly, families of some he had executed. They recognized that he had performed necessary duties with uncommon dignity, had transformed suffering into knowledge, had redeemed a cursed life through service. The burial location itself marked his transformation, not in the executioner's section of the cemetery, outside consecrated ground, but in the regular cemetery among respectable citizens. His gravestone, now lost, reportedly read, "Here lies Frantz Schmidt, who served justice and mercy with equal dedication." His son continued the medical practice, free from executioner stigma. His daughters married into merchant families. His grandchildren became full citizens, their grandfather's profession a historical curiosity rather than inherited shame. The family curse that began with forced conscription ended with imperial recognition. Schmidt's journey from executioner to healer revealed possibilities within rigid social structures. He proved that excellence could transcend prejudice, that someone could transform their fundamental social identity through sustained competence and service. He didn't just change professions, he changed the meaning of his entire life. We return to that June day in 1584, to Nuremberg's Hauptmarkt, where Hans Vogle dies on the wheel under Frantz Schmidt's precise blows. The crowd that watches doesn't know they're witnessing history. They see just another execution, another criminal receiving justice, another day in the violent theater of Renaissance law. But we now know what they couldn't, that the man breaking bones with mechanical precision would one day set them with equal skill, that the hands dealing death would become instruments of healing, that the pariah managing this brutal spectacle would die an honored citizen, mourned by the city that once couldn't bear his touch. Frantz Schmidt embodied the Renaissance paradox more completely than any artist or scholar. His life bridged medieval brutality and early modern rationality. He was simultaneously the Dark Age's last executioner and the Enlightenment's first empirical observer of judicial death. He represented both continuity with the barbaric past and evolution toward a more systematic future. The diary he left behind does more than document executions. It preserves a complete worldview where death was justice, suffering was education, and violence was order. Every entry represents not just an individual death, but societal decisions about who deserved to die, how they should die, and what their deaths should mean. 394 executions, each one approved by authorities, witnessed by crowds, considered necessary for social stability. Schmidt didn't create this system, he perfected it. He transformed crude necessity into precise ritual, random violence into measured justice, passionate revenge into dispassionate process. Yet within this brutal system, Schmidt maintained humanity that circumstances should have destroyed. He allowed dignity to the condemned within law's constraints. He minimized suffering when possible. He recorded injustices, even if he couldn't prevent them. He transformed execution from butchery into something approaching professionalism. His precision with the sword, never requiring a second stroke in 45 years, wasn't just technical skill, but moral commitment. Every clean death was a mercy within mandated cruelty. Every properly managed execution prevented the chaos that might generate sympathy for criminals. Every documented detail preserved truth about Renaissance justice for future judgment. The transition from executioner to healer seems extraordinary until we recognize the continuity. Both roles required anatomical knowledge, emotional control, and ability to manage human extremity. The executioner who guided people through death was well prepared to guide them through medical crisis. The man who understood how bodies broke understood how they healed. Schmidt's receipt of imperial honor in 1624 changed more than his personal status. It established that inherited dishonor could be overcome, that social categories weren't immutable, that excellence could transcend prejudice. His transformation from untouchable to honorable created precedent for social mobility in rigidly stratified society. But perhaps Schmidt's greatest achievement was the diary itself. By documenting every execution with clinical precision, he preserved evidence of Renaissance justice that authorities might prefer forgotten. Every entry testifies to legal violence that maintained social order. Every name records someone whose death was considered necessary for civilization's continuation. Reading the diary today, we confront uncomfortable truths about justice and necessity. Schmidt's society needed executioners, but despised them, required violence, but denied its centrality, demanded death, but considered those who delivered it polluted. These contradictions reveal justice as structured hypocrisy, maintaining order through violence while pretending violence is exceptional. Modern readers might condemn Schmidt for participating in such a system, but condemnation requires imagining alternatives that didn't exist. Born into hereditary dishonor, forbidden other professions, faced with execution himself if he refused his role, Schmidt had no choices we would recognize as free. He could perform poorly or well, cruelly or professionally, carelessly or precisely. He chose excellence within constraints. His 45 years of service coincided with unprecedented changes. The Renaissance was yielding to early modern period. Religious wars were reshaping Europe. Scientific revolution was challenging medieval worldviews. Through it all, Schmidt stood on his scaffold, dealing death with steady hand, while the world transformed around him. The crowds that gathered for executions saw justice performed. Schmidt saw something different: humanity at its worst, and occasionally its best. He saw courage in condemned facing death. He saw cruelty in crowds celebrating suffering. He saw hypocrisy in authorities who ordered deaths they couldn't perform themselves. He saw it all and recorded it without judgment, creating history's most complete record of capital punishment. For 45 years he took life. For 17 years he gave it back. This wasn't redemption exactly. Healing couldn't resurrect the executed. But it was transformation, proof that humans can change fundamentally, that identity isn't fixed, that even someone defined by dealing death can become defined by preserving life. Schmidt died having executed 394 people and healed hundreds more. The arithmetic doesn't balance. Healing doesn't cancel killing. But the trajectory matters. From death to life, from destruction to restoration, from curse to honor. His life's arc bent toward mercy, even if it began in necessary cruelty. His shadow still lingers over discussions of capital punishment, necessary violence, and social order. Every society must decide who deserves to die, who should kill them, and what killing means for both society and executioner. Schmidt's diary provides no answers, only evidence of one society's solutions and their human cost. The scaffold in Nuremberg's Hauptmarkt no longer stands. The breaking wheel has become a museum piece. The executioner's sword hangs behind glass. But the questions Schmidt's life raises remain urgent. How does society manage necessary violence? Who performs acts everyone requires but no one wants to acknowledge? What is the cost, for individuals and communities, of maintaining order through death? Frantz Schmidt spent 45 years at the intersection of law and death, justice and cruelty, necessity and horror. He was history's most prolific executioner and its most meticulous documentarian of judicial killing. He was a pariah who achieved honor, a dealer of death who became a healer, a man trapped by hereditary curse who broke free through excellence. For 45 years, he was the state's knife, cutting away what society deemed cancerous. For 17 years, he was medicine's hand, healing what could be restored. His life reminds us that history's bloodiest men were sometimes its most necessary, that those who serve justice's darkest requirements deserve recognition for their service, even if we recoil from what that service required. The diary closes with a simple entry about a final beheading. No summary, no reflection, no acknowledgement that 45 years of dealing death had ended. Just another name, another crime, another death recorded with steady hand. But in that steadiness, in that clinical precision maintained across decades of horror, lies perhaps the most human response to inhuman requirements. the determination to perform necessary evil with unnecessary excellence. Frantz Schmidt's shadow still lingers, reminding us that someone must perform society's darkest requirements, that excellence can exist even in horror, that transformation is possible even for those who seem forever bound to their roles. He was history's bloodiest executioner. He was also, in his way, one of its most honorable men. The paradox of his life: dealer of death become preserver of life, executioner become citizen, pariah become honorable, remains his most unsettling and inspiring legacy. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.